Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this really exciting event. My name is Zara Salim, and I'm an assistant professor here at the Department of Sociology at the LSE, and I'm really happy to welcome you all to this book event. So the event today is to discuss a new book by Kareem Rabie, which is entitled Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited, Capital and State Building in the West Bank, which was published in 2021 by Duke University Press. And I'm really glad to have Kareem with us here, as well as three really incredible scholars who are going to discuss the book, and we'll hopefully all have a conversation about the many kind of themes and topics that it touches on. Before I begin, just wanted to say thank you, of course, to everyone who's speaking, but also to Amy Gordon and Maddie Giles, who helped us to set this up and did all the amazing behind the scenes work. So thank you so much. So the book, Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited, is a rich exploration of a lot of different dimensions of economic and political transformations that have happened in Palestine in kind of more recently. It looks at it particularly at a shift in economic and political practice that oriented state-scale Palestinian politics towards neoliberal globalization rather than a diplomatic two-state solution. The book explores the ways in which private firms, international aid organizations, and the Palestinian government in the West Bank focused on large-scale private housing development in an attempt toward state-scale economic stability and market building, reflecting a belief that a thriving private economy would lead to a free and functioning Palestinian state. This is both an empirically rich and beautifully written book, and it's such an honor to have Kareem with us here. I was meant to bring the copy of my book with me so I could show it to you now, but I have forgotten it at home, but I'm sure, yes, there we go. So you can see it. It's a really, there's Kareem's copy as well. It's a really beautiful cover as well. So the format for today is we'll begin with Kareem, who'll talk a little bit about the context of where the book came from, and then we'll hear from each respondent before coming back to Kareem for any responses or engagements. And then we'll also open it up to audience Q&A. You can, of course, send in your questions throughout the event, either via the Facebook comment section, or you can tweet at LSE Sociology, or email sociology.media@lse.ac.uk. So I'll now introduce our speakers and then we'll get started. So Kareem Rabie is assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His work focuses on privatization, urban development, and the state building project in the West Bank. While on research leave in 2021, Kareem is a visiting fellow at CUNY's Center for Place, Culture, and Politics and Committee on Globalization and Social Change. Previously, he was an assistant professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., and the Harper Schmidt Fellow at the University of Chicago and Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Oxford Center on Migration, Policy, and Society. Our first respondent is Gökçe Günel, who is an assistant professor in anthropology at Rice University. Her latest book, Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, also a really incredible book, focuses on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the United Arab Emirates, more specifically concentrating on the Masdar City project. Our second respondent, who's also from LSE Sociology, is Lucy Garbe, who's a Palestinian writer from Jerusalem and a PhD student in the sociology department at LSE. Her research interests include urban studies, political economy, and coloniality, and she's currently researching the social life of planning processes in Jerusalem. She holds an MSc in development studies from SOAS, and before starting her PhD, she worked for a number of organizations in Palestine on political economy and gender. She's currently the co-president of the graduate section at the British BRISMUS, which is the British Middle East Studies Society, and her writing has appeared in English and Arabic in a number of outlets, such as Guardian, Marib, and the Bidayat magazine. And just to say, Lucy and I co-organized this event, so it's been a pleasure kind of bringing it all together. And our final respondent also from the LSE is Dean Sharp, who received his PhD from CUNY and who is currently an LSE Fellow in Human Geography and the Environment, so just the floor above us. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT and the co-director of Terraform, Center for Advanced Urban Research. He's the co-editor of Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprisings, and Open Gaza, which was published by the American University in Cairo Press. So welcome to everyone. It's a shame this couldn't be in person, but really looking forward to the conversation. And I'm going to hand it over to Kareem now.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks so much to the organizers and to everybody for speaking today, to Sada, to Gokce, to Lucy, Dean, Amy, and Maggie, and to everybody who might be watching it on Facebook. So the organizers have asked me to speak for 10 or so minutes today before opening up for a conversation, and I'd like to do a couple of things. First, to tell you a little bit about the book, what I did and what I think that I was trying to do, and then to talk briefly about what I think my work can contribute right now in a period of both increased struggle in response to various kinds of Israeli violence, as well as increased attention on Palestine. So a bit about the book. The book is, to me, an ethnography of the political economics of state building in the West Bank. Through a few intertwined case studies, I tried to show some of the big picture practices that are reshaping Palestine by reconfiguring the West Bank vis-a-vis Israel. And I hope to show how some of these practices, actors, and material consequences are relevant for the future there. I began the book with a discussion of a massive new private housing development being constructed north of Ramallah called Rawabi. There's been a ton of attention on it since I started this research and certainly in the time between my fieldwork and the book coming out, but I think my work does something a little bit different than the prevailing orientation. I use it as a site where a lot of the changes to investment, to development, to the forms of state, to land tenure, and so on are visible. I began there and with developers and designers, and then tried to move outwards to interviews with financiers and people from the development apparatus. I looked at their studies that elaborate the idea of a housing shortage in Palestine, a shortage that the PA, developers, and aid agencies are helping the private sector to both craft and meet. I discussed changes in the idea of state and urban planning in Palestine and how public-private partnerships are remaking the scale of governance there. I explored how Rawabi targets potential buyers based on specific ideas about the land in Palestine and what that might have to do with increased class stratification through new forms of private landholding and legal precedent. And at the same time, I really wanted to listen to the potential buyers and understand their aspirations and how large developments, debt, and new forms of home life fit into them. I look at jurisdiction and the fights over the legal basis for landholding through disputes between Rawabi developers and right-wing Zionist groups. I tried to see what it might tell us about the liberal politics and law in the West Bank. And I think there are a couple of straightforward and embedded arguments here. I want to use anthropology to talk about the ways that phenomena on multiple geographical scales have bearing on people's lives. And I tried to toggle scales and triangulate questions. Within Palestine studies, there's been a strong orientation towards what Omar Sharbadi Salamanca calls the School of Occupation Studies, and Omar Tasdel calls Greenlineism. Now, what my two geographer Omar friends are identifying, I think, is the real narrowing of analysis and method towards the occupation by first assuming it, and second, towards its present contours and appearances. When I first started doing the research as a diaspora Palestinian, I was interested not only in return, but in looking outwards. And I struggled to make sense of the practices that aren't resistive in the ways that we might be predisposed to see or understand them. I'll return to that in the last part of my comments. I'm also a person who cares about cities, Marx, and political economy, and I think you can see all three in the toggling between everyday practices, capital, investment, and the state. As for the politics of the book, it's been really illuminating to see how it's being received. And I think there's a lot going on, I think it's going to look different for different readers. I hope it's read by Palestinians thinking about the state, capital, class stratification, movement. I'm not alone, of course, in working in that mode. I think I make sort of a couple of contributions there and about seeing capital and context as an object of study in Palestine. What I mean is that the dynamics of capital and capitalism produce relations and contexts that can be seen historically and projected forward. I think that class ought to be a greater part of the analysis. It also ought to be part of discussions about the geographies of stratification and movement and unity. And once productive social relations, capital and class are on the table, I hope, that there's a basis to move outwards and see what possibilities actually are in Palestine and for interconnected struggles beyond it. So now let me talk a little bit about what I think this might have to do, or how it engages with what's going on in Palestine right now. Now, I admit it's hard. It's been hard for me, having this book come out in May, to talk about capitalism and aspiration and stratification right now. It's even harder to convince myself or others sometimes about an approach that tries to move beyond analysis of subjugation and resistance, when the biggest story right now, and the thing that we all ought to be focusing on, is precisely another ebullition in Jerusalem and Gaza, and more visible and widespread Palestinian unity in response. What I can offer, I think, is a way to situate it all. I recently read around it in Harsha Walia's new book, and she describes borders and bordering as forms of racial capitalist statecraft. And I think that starts to get us toward the state dimensions of these questions. Or also, the way that Bashir Abu Menna put it in a talk in May or early June, he said that the reason that we're seeing resistance inside and in Gaza is in part because they're not what he called the Oslo territories. So if stabilization is an ongoing set of practices that emerged through Oslo, it also helps understand the recent visibility of settlers and settler violence inside. Here's how I put it in the book. The practices that surround ideas and representations of housing, of aspiration, and so on, go a long way in producing stability and orienting ideas and frameworks around future interventions. In a Middle East characterized by widespread resistance to autocratic governments, resistance that has often been inspired by the Palestinian struggle against colonization and Israeli occupation, Ramallah might be, in some ways and for some people, one of the more insulated and stable places in the region. In terms of class aspiration and stability, there are not many places in the West Bank other than Ramallah where a refracted image of normal everyday life is permissible. Palestine refers less and less to territory and to fewer and fewer Palestinians. At the same time, as a target of interventions, it does much more work. Economic interventions orient Palestine towards the global market. The Palestine of the West Bank stands in for historic Palestine, and the diaspora comes to limit wider possibilities. And as far as cities are concerned, Ramallah and its surrounding areas are the primary sites for development as market building, and they exist in a vacuum enabled by the distribution of Israeli state violence elsewhere. Moreover, Ramallah is an idea and a representation that circulates to further plans and intervention. It's a place and an image for aspiration and growth as politics. So I was thinking about work from like Lisa Taraki, from Ghada Karmi when I wrote that sort of thing. So for me, much of Zionist imperative is predicated on erasure, both physical and in terms of making it impossible to live as a Palestinian or as an indigenous person. And I think that one of the sort of undercurrents that runs through this is all these discussions about settler colonialism and settler colonial studies. And so Patrick Wolf, I think, was taken up in a lot of ham-handed ways. But it's worth remembering that what he was responding to was an argument within the academic discipline of genocide studies. And he proposed this idea of eliminationist logic as an alternative. And that logic brings with it new contexts and possibilities to disaggregate Palestinians from their land and life worlds and attach them elsewhere. So I'm sort of thinking about what Ramallah looks like as the flip side of things like center of life policies, or things that Lucy can tell us a lot about. And there are elite Palestinians who are able to benefit within that context, to accommodate and or to get rich and or to reframe nationalism. But they're not doing it by confrontation, but by presenting an alternative. And now the other thing to say is that maybe this moment is the time that all this focused investment in market building and stabilization fails. And I really don't know. We might just see more money plowed in, more accumulation at the top, and more instability distributed downwards. But I hope, again, what I've done is to show sort of the flip side to what's happening now, the sort of geographical spread of what's happening now, the places and forms of life that enable and are enabled by what happens throughout Palestine. So I will stop there and start to listen. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Kareem. That was a great opening. I'll hand it over to Gökçe now.
Thank you, Kareem, and thank you to the organizers for setting up this event and for including me in it. First, I want to say what a pleasure it was to read this book. In some ways, because it felt like reading a mirror of a book I myself published recently on the construction of an eco-city in Abu Dhabi called Masdar City. So thank you, Kareem, for writing it and for also giving it such a great title. So Kareem and I have, I think, very similar objects of observation in our projects. So 2 planned cities under construction in the Middle East. And our objects of study are relatively different, but complementary. So Palestine is throwing a party, has an interest in transforming logics of the state and capitalism, for instance, whereas my book tried to understand what the construction of an eco-city means in regards to climate change. So as I was reading the text, I was reminded of a conversation I had with another Palestine scholar, Sophia Samatopoulou-Robbins, a decade ago at a panel at the AAAs. So Sophia and I had just met and we were exchanging simple notes on our dissertation fieldwork, which was happening then. And when we came to realize that none of the infrastructure projects that we analyzed in Palestine or the UAE were ever completed. So for those of you who might not know, Sophia also wrote a great book called Wastage that looks at Palestine. So I'm bringing up this exchange because both the Gulf and Palestine tend to be exceptionalized for various reasons, but there's quite a bit that they share. And reading Kareem's book really foregrounded those shared qualities for me. And the book, I think, is very explicit in showing the kinds of parallels between Israel and Palestine and showing the ways in which they mirror each other. But it made me also ask, if you were to stretch these dynamics beyond these 2 actors and think about the Middle East more broadly, what kinds of parallels would we find? So is there a conversation we can have about how the Middle East makes itself known through Rabie? So since I started with a comment on how things don't get completed in Palestine or the UAE, perhaps I can continue with a question on potentiality. So I read much of Kareem's book with this comparison in mind and thinking about what potentiality might mean in the context that he's describing. So what kind of social, political, and financial roles does incompleteness of Rabie serve here in this manuscript? And surely, of course, incompleteness is contextual and different from different everywhere. And so I want to make sure that we think about incompleteness not as an ontological category, but rather as an epistemological one here. And given the specific possibilities that housing generates in reordering social life, I was very excited to see a discussion of how the project that Kareem looks at promises a transformation of kinship structures, for instance, in Palestine. And I wondered, what are some other material ways in which housing shapes the structures of possibility here? So how would, and I'm broadly thinking about how would a housing project be different from another kind of infrastructure project, say if road construction? So in another section of the book, we encounter a much more matter-of-fact conversation where one employee explains how they're getting paid, aren't they? Emphasizing that the incompleteness of the project not only produces specific arrangements regarding how to live in an indeterminate future or how to aspire for an indeterminate future, but also shapes mundane everyday practices by providing, say, salaries to some groups of people. And I wanted to ask very broadly, what are the ideas of the future that make this project compelling to their builders and to future inhabitants that are specific to the Palestinian context? And if we're able to scale this up a bit, what does the Rabie project say more broadly about conceptualizations of the future and how imaginations of the future are mobilized towards specific goals and purposes globally? So discussions of scale are very important to Kareem's book, and I really enjoyed this emphasis. And discussions of scale are not only operating here temporally, but also spatially. And so in the book, we see that Rabie stands in for the possibility of a smooth, spatially expansive market, which operates in a post-occupation environment. And in a thoughtful passage in the book, this is on page 71, Kareem says, and I can read this bit very quickly, the rhetoric of peace and universality cannot easily project across the conflict and above overlapping geographies of dispossession and forms of race-based territorial governance. Universals are not shared or available to Palestinians. They're encompassed and unevenly distributed within Israel. In some ways, even if or when this future, the promised future arrives, it will not be available to many within Palestine. And I was curious to see more of sort of how are these boundaries of possibility drawn or how they shift in the spaces that Kareem is looking at. And what are some of the ideas of universality that the Rabie project foregrounds through its principles of design. So the discussion on how the housing project is itself a settlement similar to Israeli settlements were very provocative here, I think. What are some other spatial representations of these boundaries as we might observe them within this housing project? And would any of the experiences of the people who began to inhabit this new city in the last few years possibly give us some clues here? So beyond the very exciting conceptual questions that the book is asking, I was also drawn to its methodological struggles. So in so many parts of the book, we read about how Kareem tries to meet specific people and cannot, sends emails and receives surprising phone calls in response, looks for specific reports and ends up reaching them through other unexpected means. And in parts, it almost feels as if there's a parallel between the incompleteness of the housing project and the incompleteness of some of Kareem's attempts at reaching the right documents or the right people. And we see the machineries of Rawabi almost make themselves known through Kareem's methodological explorations as well. And so I wanted to hear more about sort of how the specific positionality, how Kareem's specific positionality as a researcher shaped these kinds of encounters, and see how the project came about. And I was also very curious to know more about the decisions that Kareem makes regarding, say, not including Rawabi's name in the book summary in the back of the book, or sort of thinking about how altering the name of the project itself actually acts as a sort of an exercise of advertising for the project, and how he does not want to do that. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the kinds of decisions that shape that framing of the project. And yeah, I'll end there, and I'm very excited to hear the rest of the comments and hear the discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for those great comments and questions. Over to you, Lucy.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks so much. Great interventions. I'm really so happy to be part of this conversation, and thanks as well to everyone who helped organize it, and Sarah as well for her quite kind insistence that I join the conversation. Thanks. I've been so looking forward to this book coming out. Like, I feel like it's always been cropping up, cited as a PhD thesis that I couldn't access in so many texts, and I've always been so really on tender hooks to wait to read it. And so I'm so glad that it's now out in the world. And as Kareem was saying, you know, there's a growing literature that's kind of been more concerned with sort of more contemporary political economic and political economy and sort of class in Palestine. But I mean, there's been very, very few studies that deal with this ethnographically. So Kareem's sort of political economic ethnography of this private housing development in Palestine, I think, will really be, and I hope will be, a major launching pad for a lot more future research on these issues, and centering class as well, but also using these methodologies with all their, as Dr. was mentioning, its troubles. And in my intervention today, I'm going to focus on two main parts of the book that I think really contribute important discussions within the field of Palestine studies, and a few questions as well. And so the first point I wanted to bring up was what I think the book does really brilliantly is in its commitment and grounding within Palestinian history and knowledge production. The book doesn't fall into categories or traps of seeing neoliberalism or the Oslo Accords in the 1990s as moments of major rupture, or take them to be the starting points in the timeline of investigation. And instead, Kareem encourages us to understand Oslo within longer histories of economic and political control, and see it as a moment of transition of a greater uneven integration into regional and world markets. And in this kind of dislocation of common framings and understandings, in a lot of the studies of Palestine, the book draws on a rich body of work, and I really wanted to congratulate you for that. I think it's not often noticed, citation practices and things, and in particular, chapter 8, Capital Critique and the Landscape, I thought was really an amazing chapter, and there's a wonderful discussion that kind of charts how notions of the rural past and the Palestinian fallah, the peasant, as both signifier and symbol, emerges both to unite Palestinians and link them to the soil. But you also then show us how this has been based on a version of history that has obscured class and economic relations, and how these have shifted over time. And you bring this then into discussion with the Rawabi project, and how both critics and supporters of the project engage in these forms of romanticism. And instead you draw our attention to market logics, Palestinian capitalists, and settler colonial imperatives, and how they interact together. And I suppose this kind of then takes me to the second part of the book that I thought was a really important contribution, which is your notion of uneven integration. And in drawing on notions of uneven development, you see these so-called zones of stabilization, not as anomalies to the settler colonial context in Palestine, but rather as part of it. And you attribute it to a more contemporary outcome of Walter Rodney's underdevelopment thesis, and pose it alongside previous work that has analyzed Palestine as a case of de-development or separated. And I liked especially how you draw our attention to how forms of structural dependence can produce zones of these so-called stability and produce market relations, rather than strictly only exploitative modes of production alone. And I suppose I have a few questions on this. And one is the idea you present that these zones of stability come at the expense of others. And I think you also attribute a geographic scale to this. So you frame these sort of state-city scale accumulations and developments in a place like Ramallah, coming at the expense of other places in historic Palestine. And I think that this is a really compelling argument to look at the kind of uneven topography of Palestinian social relations and how this can be connected and concentrated in particular geographic spaces. Although I wonder if perhaps this can be expanded within the Palestinian context to also move beyond Ramallah. And I quote here from the book, you say, as Palestine collapses into Ramallah and Ramallah is given an outward orientation, forms of social life, liberation, politics, and aspiration are foreclosed throughout the West Bank, Gaza, Israel, and the Palestinian diaspora. Building for relative freedom in Ramallah is the flip side of policing elsewhere. And while I certainly agree with this, I think that Ramallah has played a very particular role. It's the center of economic and political activity to some extent in the West Bank. But I wonder too about our role as researchers, and I definitely include myself in this, whether we too have collapsed Palestine into Ramallah and are blinded in a way by its flashing lights that invite us to focus on it. And I wonder a bit about, urban developments, consumption patterns, and changing social relations in places like Jericho, for example, that have seen a proliferation of villas built by wealthy families from all over the West Bank, including Nablus and Hebron, in addition to previous patterns of more wealthier families from Jerusalem or Ramallah that already had properties in this area. But I wonder also about urban developments in Hebron and Nablus, and while they are not Ramallah, my question is, to what extent can these bounded sites of the sort of spectacular that are filled with PR, that have these named actors behind them, tell us more broadly about class stratification patterns in the built environment between Palestinians? And I ask, to what extent is this also, for example, with the book, a story about Jerusalem, not at the expense of Jerusalem, but that similar patterns take place in zones or spaces of so-called stability and uneven integration in the diaspora, for example, across Palestinian cities? I guess that's my question. And it's also drawing a bit on my research so far in Jerusalem, which very much in early stages, but you can kind of see how middle-class neighborhoods in the northern periphery, such as Palestinian neighborhoods such as Beit Hanina and Shafat, are expanding and are allowed to expand, whereas neighborhoods in the Old City Basin, such as Silwan, are facing increasing demolition orders and dispossession. And interestingly, the same company that built Rawabi is now engaged in a project in Beit Hanina in Jerusalem called Lana, that plays on the nationalist phrase of Al-Quds Lana to Lana fi Al-Quds Haya, which I think is really interesting as well, but for another discussion. So, and then it also brought me to a point I wanted to ask about the research and the process of writing this book, because you're Palestinian and you came to Palestine interested in political economy at the beginning of your research, and you're critical of what the term occupation might have foreclosed in terms of understandings of historical and geographical oppression and erasures that Palestinians face. And as someone who's researching and interested in Palestinian class dynamics as well, I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the reception of your research and interests in different contexts, including inside and outside of Palestine, and how focusing on the particular constructions of homes in the midst of so many being dispossessed is part of the same story. And at least I think it is, I certainly believe it is, but I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the process of reaching this analysis and how it felt, and the reception and pushback, if any, as well. And then it brings me to my last kind of reflection, which is on social reproduction. And similarly to Gokce, I wanted to say that in the chapter on housing shortage and national priority, you set out how this so-called housing shortage was created by Palestinian institutions and international actors, and how encouraging the idea of home ownership through more available mortgages was parts of also these ideas of encouraging people, young people, to move out of family homes and changing kinship patterns. I suppose my question here is how you address the idea of social reproduction within the book, because you reference it quite a bit and you make links at how capital and family life and gender roles are constitutive, but then we don't get to see very much in the book about how this actually translates into shifting social reproduction patterns. And I think this is also, part of the tricky timeline of the book, where your research started and ended even before the concrete of Rawabi sort of actually was lived in. But, I was speaking to a friend who teaches at Birzeit University the other day, and she was mentioning that a lot of her colleagues send their children to the school in Rawabi through a bus that goes every day between Ramallah and Rawabi, even if they're very critical of the project of Rawabi. And I'm curious about this kind of shifting density in Palestinian homes that's moving from the kind of extended family house to more nuclear families that are living in these apartment blocks that are set up in that, and what that then means for care work and social relations more broadly. So if these housing projects are all based on the idea that they're living away from the extended family, then what kind of infrastructure needs to be created in order to support these shifting social reproduction patterns, where children and the elderly might need to be cared for outside of the home, for example. And what kind of implications does that hold then also for like labor and gender roles and norms, and also the cost of life? And so then thinking about Rawabi today and things, I suppose it's not really lived in as a housing project per se, but the main elements of it are this fantastical mall they created as part of the project that has these international brands like Mango and Zara, and offering Palestinians the opportunity of buying these brands, and that the school with its aspirational aspects to it is, and the office spaces and research are seen as the most successful parts of it. So I suppose as well, like if you were to, and it's quite a difficult question, but like if you were to kind of come at this research project now today, like what would you do differently, or what do you think it might look like if you had to start at it differently? I don't know. It's a difficult question, but I was curious to hear what you think. And thanks.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Really interesting comments and questions. And I'll hand it now over to Dean.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And well, thanks for those wonderful comments as well. That I don't want to spread this conversation too thin. So I'll also kind of maybe just add to some of the comments that Lucy and Gotcha have also said, and things that I was particularly interested in. But I actually want to touch firstly on this question of rupture in the framework of critical urban Arab studies. And maybe Kareem, if you could also, in your comments, respond to how you see this book fitting in, because personally, I do see a rupture in the scholarship around critical urban studies within the Arab world. That I think there's a real wave at the moment of these critical approaches that is really invigorating, and I see, this book very much a part of. Gotcha mentioned her own book that I see as part of this, but scholars like Najib Burani, Ahmed Kana, Omar Salamanca, who you also mentioned. Then, of course, at AUB, there are people like Mona Harb and Fawaz, and studying also similar types of large-scale urban developments, things that we could also call physical manifestations of neoliberalism, neoliberal urbanization. So is there then a rupture in the academic scholarship in terms of there's just a dramatic rise now of people concerned with these objects? Or is this maybe something that is also happening materially? Like, is there a different scale in urban transformation going on that is causing more people to study it? Or is that the wrong way to frame it? Kareem, I really would love to get your kind of insights into that. But I certainly see it in terms of critical urban Arab studies as a really exciting moment, and many people such as yourself are really producing excellent work. And I wanted to touch on this methodological struggle that both Lucy and Gotcha touched upon. Because firstly, just to stress what a remarkable job you do in studying a moving target, and to stress, that what, a project that, is unfolding as you're studying it is a courageous challenge to take on. And I think you've done it really successfully. And then added on to that, you've got this struggle, as Garbe mentioned, of focusing on Rabie, and there's no doubt that it anchors the book and is the center of this study, but not wanting then to make this book about it, because this isn't a book about Rabie as its central purpose. It's about, as you say on the title, capital and state building in the West Bank. So firstly, just to again highlight what a remarkable job you do in making sure that that central focus of your study is maintained and illuminated. But also, if you could elaborate on that that practice as well. As someone that has written on Solidaire in Beirut, it's also a similar struggle that I've had to, ensure that Solidaire isn't actually the central thing that you want to talk about. And just like your central interlocutor, Nasri, I certainly didn't want to make Hariri about, this magical figure that just conjures up everything. And again, you do a really good job of doing that. And also in maybe flattening that presence, you also, highlight the role of other figures that also touch on this outward focus rather than inward, that I really think brings a sophisticated analysis to this case study, and illuminates, for instance, the role of figures like Tony Blair in his insidious role is really kind of illuminated quite remarkably. And again, maybe in the comments, if you could touch upon how you see Blair in fitting into this project would be wonderful. So I think that those are really interesting ways that this book presents this study. And another aspect that I wanted to perhaps raise with and bring up to the conversation is this tension, not only in the book, but within Middle East studies more broadly, and Palestine studies in particular, with post-colonial approaches and the more materialist work of Harvey and Smith. And of course, as you make clear, this is very much a book anchored in the thinking and theories of David Harvey and Neil Smith. And, that tension there is perhaps evident in the book. And again, to touch upon that, it's interesting, you only mentioned Edward Said once, and it's to comment on Raymond Williams' work. And I'm just interested in how you think about post-colonial theory and the approaches, because there are interesting discussions again about scale, but also about universalism. You are not wanting perhaps to take the same kind of universalist approach that Harvey would want, or has perhaps been characterized by it. And you are wanting to situate the global processes in material and contextual ways. And again, to just ask, I think you do it in a really nuanced and sophisticated way. And if this is, your thinking in terms of how to basically make sure that Harvey's work touches the ground, or that kind of situated universalism and situated global approaches. And finally, just to say perhaps some things that I'd also love to hear your thoughts on in terms of the ecological dimensions, thinking also in relation to the type of work that Garbe did with Mazda, and questions like urban metabolism that is increasingly being brought into the conversation around planetary urbanization, and thinking along those lines of and lineages of thought. Did you think and expand upon perhaps like how Rabie impacted the environmental context of these situations, and thinking around those questions of urban metabolism?
Great, thank you. Was that it, Dean? Or did
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Wow, there's a lot there. So I think it's testament to how interesting the book is. So I know you probably can't answer all of that, Kareem, but I'm going to hand it back to you to maybe pick out the ones you'd like to maybe talk about so we can get the conversation started. And if anybody watching has questions, please do post them in the chat. So back to you, Kareem.
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. This is too many people to have respond. Too many questions. I wrote everything down, so if you all want to bring them back up in conversation, you should, because there's zero chance that I'm going to mention all of it now. I think that I want to start with, all three of you kind of talked about the method, the sort of either specific questions about what it was like, or Lucy, how it was felt. The method and how I engage with the sort of different bodies of literature was one thing that came through. Yeah, oh God. Well, I think that one of the things that I tried to do, I think Lucy, you sort of you presented it this way, and I think that you got it, you sort of saw what was happening, which was that I was sort of trying to start with Palestine studies, my sort of like relationship to Palestine studies, and kind of trying to find a lot of what was happening there, wanting or maybe not like sufficiently explanatory to what I was finding. And then as an anthropologist, trying to see how, you know, anthropology could help us to understand what was going on. I mean, I definitely don't think that it's like an application of Harvey or Smith, but I mean, I think that those were two thinkers that were helping me try to understand the sort of the big picture and how it relates to what's happening on the ground. Similarly, the question of social reproduction, which was helping me try to sort of make the link between the sort of the scales. And I think Lucy, again, you sort of got it right, and everybody sort of had a similar critique here, I think, which is like you know, how, like, what's actually going on there? What do I have the capacity to say about what's going on? And you know, this is something Lisa Rofel wrote a review of it that was like extremely kind, but this was also her critique too, which is that like more needed to be there on the sort of specificities of it and the kind of like specificities of this class stratification stuff that I'm talking about, what the home life consists of, things like that. And I mean, I the only answer I can give you is one that's just like is going to be wanting, right? Which is that it was really pretty hard to write a book about something in process, you know. And this relates to what would I do if I was doing it today. I mean, I would have more stuff to talk about. I think the sort of ethnography of class stratification, of home life would be there, you know, as the place gets more lived in, or as it sort of has more of a social life, as questions of sort of care work are being shifted to private schools, probably private nurseries, stuff like that. I mean, I think that's kind of pretty straightforward. And then I think that this would also help me to sort of better flesh out the kinds of things that Goche, you're asking about like, you know, what are the specific ideas of the future? What are the forms of universality, either that sort of developers and state people share or have alongside the sort of conceptions or potentially changing conceptions of people through living in this place. Like you said it pretty explicitly in terms of like the question of how housing restructures, how it shapes structures of possibilities, things like that. I mean, I think that putting the Goche question and the Lucy question together, I mean, I would have more to talk about there. I think that the way that it was available to me to study, but also the one that I'm sort of inclined to be interested in, I mean, I'm not trying to be defensive here necessarily, was about the kind of like the sort of general scale practices, like how the sort of like the state and the developers are doing these things, and sort of like what the outcomes are. I think another critique was similarly like why don't I put Rawabi on the back of the book, or question is, whatever, it's fine. And so I did actually mention Salim Tamati made the point explicitly. He said, like, writing about Rawabi in the first place has a danger of being an advertisement for it. And he's not wrong, and that's why I put it in the book, right? I think that yeah, again, this is just one of those things. Like, I mean, you all know writing something is really difficult, and you end up having so many more questions. It's also hard to write about something in process and to be somebody who thinks in terms of conversations in process, to then suddenly be on the hook for something. Like, it stinks. But I think that, like, that's the answer to it, is I do really think about and care about process. And I think that a lot of the things that I think the claims sort of emerge from that, the arguments emerge from that, and also a lot of the sort of like difficulties and weaknesses of it, And that was also part of the reason previous versions didn't have a lot of that ethnographic stuff, didn't have stuff about chasing people down and things like that. And somebody who read an early version of it, there were like these endless footnotes about it all. And somebody who read an earlier version said, like, this is good stuff, you should put it in. And then it sort of struck me as I decided to do that, that it was a way to swim around in the process and the method stuff. And also, I think that I hope that it's read by students of anthropology, maybe undergraduates, whatever, thinking about like, this is what it might look like to try to study general scale phenomenon as an anthropologist, and I think that, yeah, there are both things I managed and things that I couldn't do because of that approach. I mean, this is something that I would be interested to hear all you all talk about, because I think everybody's sort of work and practice kind of engages this in a little way, in some ways. And Gocha, I mean, I think that you're right. Your book, I think, has a lot of resonances. I read it, I loved it, I taught it. It was not out when I was revising and in production, which is actually, it would have been better, I think, had I had that opportunity. But I mean, I think that the future and the promise and the what was it that you said? You said about about the incompleteness, right? And I think the incompleteness is also the same thing as process. And I think that that's what I wanted to talk about, is how process generates things. I guess the last thing I want to say, which is not some big point or anything, but Dean, you mentioned Tony Blair. When I was at the second Palestine Investors Conference, I took this out of the book, but when I was at the second Palestine Investors Conference, it was one of the few times that I had Wi-Fi, and I emailed my supervisor, who was the geographer Neil Smith, and then he happened to be in front of the computer, and we were emailing back and forth, and I sent him a picture of Tony Blair speaking at a lectern, and he was like, "Kareem, get out of there. Go home immediately, take a shower." That was the advice about Tony Blair in this process. So I think I hit some of it, and we can keep talking about it. It's also, I just thank you all for reading it so carefully, and for I think seeing a lot of what I was trying to do and what worked and what didn't. And I'm really grateful for your attention, and yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Kareem. And also, if Dean or Lucy or Gokce, if you want to come in again, it would be great to maybe turn this into more of a conversation. If I could also ask a question, which is sometimes an annoying question, but I'm always really interested in kind of the connections. I mean, when we finish these big projects, I think, at least in my case, I was already kind of really wanting to move on and do something else after you spend so much time on something. But obviously, these projects are often connected. So I was curious about whether, while doing this work, you kind of started thinking about other types of projects that you'd want to do, or maybe things that popped up during field work or during the writing that kind of have opened up different research questions or trajectories. It'd be great to hear about that. And I guess another maybe smaller question was, I was struck, for example, when both in kind of Dean and Gökçe's and Lucy's work, but also Lucy's comment during her response about these spaces as being not really lived in, but still often what they're providing is these kind of very aspirational, futuristic things like these malls, for example. And it reminded me quite a bit of Cairo as well, kind of these new developments outside of Cairo where huge, there's so much that's been built, so much of it is actually empty. People are not living in these kind of flats or villas, but the malls are doing really well. I mean, the shopping malls, the private schools, all of these other things that were built alongside these, housing settlements are actually, packed or busy and being expanded endlessly. So I was really interested in your thoughts, or maybe for people who haven't read the book, about these regional maybe connections or similarities that we're seeing across different countries as well. Are these connected to, who's investing or questions of capital? Is there something else that's happening? Because I'm always really struck by, the similarities we're seeing across different spaces. And I imagine it's probably also across the global South more broadly in some ways. So I'd love to hear more about how you thought about maybe these regional connections or disconnections or things that are appearing across different spaces. If you have anything to say about that.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think that your last point is tied to Dean's question also, which is about the sort of like broadening out of critical urban Arab studies. And I think that like I think there's probably just a similarity in approach, just like the sort of like questions of specificity and ultra situatedness are no longer valid. And I think that people are trying to think about links to other places, links through capital investment, links through sort of ideological practices, links especially through development, which is something that we see a lot in Palestine, and trying to sort of broaden out, not just regionally, but to sort of worldwide questions of capital and capital investment. I think this is also related a bit to the question of Lucy, of the sort of have we as researchers collapsed too much into Ramallah. And I think that I can only sort of go back to the discussion of process and the sort of like how I was trying to understand what's happening there versus what's happening in other places. And I think that the answer to that question, which is not just Ramallah, but might be Beirut or parts of Cairo, whatever, is that there's sort of modeling of a certain sort of practice, of a certain approach. It's not really the sort of eco city or it's not the same kind of project, but it's a similar kind of sort of spatial investment and capital investment at scale. And I think that the process is important, because one of the things that I tried to do through the discussion of the real estate development project was not just talk about the sort of like the relationship of Ramallah to the place, but also to talk about how land tenure is changing, how mortgages are now being enabled by this process. And so right there, it's an opportunity to link to other, we can say flows of capital or changing forms of development aid or so on. And so like right there, it stops being a sort of a uniquely Palestinian question. It starts being a much wider one. And I think that, the research trajectory, so all the time that I spent in Palestine, this is my sort of next research interest is on sort of the ways that people have been talking about China. There are sort of like jokes about China or ideas that there's like Shawadar, of the Palestinians in China. And so I went twice in 2015 and 2017 between Palestine and China to first try to sort of like index the stories and jokes that people are telling. I won't tell any of the jokes here because some of them are pretty weird or risque. But you know, trying to like say, okay, can I find this like little Hebron in somewhere in China? And so I went around and I met with Palestinians in Beijing, a little bit in Shanghai, in Yiwu and Guangzhou. And it struck me that the stories that the sort of ordinary people in Palestine are telling are not quite getting it, but there are sort of these Palestinian diaspora communities within China who are sort of mostly organized around trade, a lot of them with Palestine. So it struck me that these traders who are sort of organizing import and export are really understand, you know, sort of the movement of capital, but also the changing sort of like market possibilities within the West Bank, and also how sort of bureaucratic mechanisms, standards requirements, customs regimes, stuff like that are part of how the West Bank market is being sort of structured within and in suspension to Israel. And so I started to I mean, the research trajectory really is like taking these questions and trying to move outward, you know, regionally in terms of capital investment and so on. So that's my goal there. I've done some, you know, I traveled twice. I was supposed to be gone much of this year, but obviously that was impossible. But soon, I'm writing something about it now, actually. PalFest asked me to write something about it, so I am going to do that. And yeah, I mean, I think that I can't really give very solid answers, except to say that like one of my goals is to try to understand the specificity of Palestine in relation to sort of worldwide practices, worldwide phenomenon, and so on.
Kareem, can I ask, pick up on partly this question of the influence of other urban developments in the region? Because in the book it doesn't come up, but I'm wondering if in the course of the research it did. Were other projects like Solidaire or Abdali in Amman, were they referenced or indexed in any way? Was that influence present at all?
Can I just add to that question before you answer, Kareem? I was also quite struck by the expertise of one of the people that you talk about in Vietnamese urban planning, and I think one of the ACOM people that you talk about had built a city in Vietnam. So there's almost like there's a different kind of exchange that's happening there. Maybe, I'm not sure, I'm just speculating, but I was wondering if you could say something about that. I looked at the footnote that you have about it, but maybe it would be great to hear from you here.
Yeah, you know, the developers weren't really making that many comparisons to other places. They did reference Solidaire in terms of like class aspiration sorts of things, but not in terms of planning or anything like that. The person that you mentioned was an early architect based in the US who was hired to work on the plan and then sort of like fell out of the picture at some point. But he worked on his own and with AECOM on sort of the massive, how do you say it? Like massive projects, you know, all over the world. You know, it's a firm that works on like Olympic villages and huge urban development projects and stuff like that. And the Vietnamese thing came up. It was pretty interesting. I mean, I didn't sort of push him on the question at all. The Vietnamese thing came up because he was using it as the counterexample of, you know, of how planning can, not the counterexample, like a relevant analog for how planning can sort of lift people up, you know. And he sort of said like the situation in Vietnam was extremely backwards. And then we did planning and it sort of raised the sort of social life and economic conditions and so on and so forth. But all those people that I spoke with in the sort of early parts of planning for Rawabi who were based in America really said things like, you know, our plan could be anywhere. and I think that this, we would do the same plan for a city in the States, for a city in Europe, for a city anywhere. Like these are the economic things you need. These are the services you need, and so on. And so like it's a good question, and one that probably should have occurred to me more, but like the sort of the way they sort of skip the kind of regional scale immediately and sort of talk about universal ideas and aspiration. I mean, they use that word. That's not me being an academic about it. I mean, they use words like universal aspiration and so on. Yeah. Is there another question?
It almost feels like there are two movements that are following each other. On the first one being sort of a move to decontextualize, and then the second one being a move to sort of recontextualize by adding the olive trees, by adding the sort of a specific Palestinian flair to the project. And again, this, I think, almost seems like there's a toolkit here that we could develop together, where, because these are the things that I was observing at Masdar as well, where there's a sort of a move to decontextualize, to say this city could be built anywhere, and then to bring in the wind towers and to bring in, the specific kinds of, vernacular, formalisms to the project, to say, okay, you know what, actually, this is not about this. This is about Abu Dhabi, or about the Middle East, or about the Arab world, something like so. So yeah, it's fascinating to see parallel movements emerging in both of these projects.
Yeah, this is sort of related to one thing that I forgot to answer before, which is the question of like how I think people are receiving it, or struggles against it, or what have you. And the one thing that developers did talk about at the beginning of the project was settlements. And so they had met with Moshe Safdie, who I interviewed, and they were justifiably proud of the sort of engagement with him. He's an important and very famous architect. He's a nice guy, and then the sort of Palestinians, youth organizers, and others sort of found out about it or read something about it, and sort of started, strengthening the existing critique of this housing development as a settlement, right? And they said like they're talking to an architect who's designed a settlement, and so on. And so there is that connection that people make, and on the reception that people have, or how do people talk about Garbe? I mean, I think that, like, I mentioned this a little bit, but there's like a pretty unfriendly reception to it in Palestine. I mean, youth activists, anti-normalization activists have protested the head of the development for Masdar personally, and there's this sort of like ambient sense that it's something outside of Palestine, and I take that seriously. I also want to take seriously like the fact that people can express aspirations in this place. Like I don't want to sort of judge or criticize potential buyers, because I think that one of the things that the developers are doing successfully is marketing a promise to people. And I think that it's worth trying to understand why people would want that, in a situation that's characterized by, the threat of violence and insecurity and instability. I mean, I think that it's pretty clear why somebody would be convinced by the idea that they could have their life be a different way. So I think that yeah, there are a lot of people, are against it for, practical reasons, aesthetic reasons, because of what it's doing in terms of the meager funds of the PA, because it's sort of understood as a normalization project and so on. And then there are others who are really excited about it. That's true of it as well.
Kareem, could you maybe could we talk a bit more about the difficulty, or in the introduction you said it's hard to talk about capitalism rather than resistance, and maybe to just expand it and get into that, because in some ways I think that such a study as yours that is deeply immersed in the context and focus on Palestinians and Palestine is also deeply humanizing, and for those that are perhaps not familiar with the context, you know, a way in that, again, pushing back against this exceptionalization framing that, you know, I think that this work is an important part of doing, and is essential work that could, I think, you know, also be framed as a form of resistance, if you like. But maybe to hand back to you.
And also, if I could just jump in there too, I think it reminds me a bit at the beginning, Kareem, where you were talking about how you could fit the sort of launching of your book back in May, you know, on this topic in the context of everything that was unfolding. I'm sure no one could have really imagined would reach the heights it did and things. And there I feel compelled also to make the links of, you know, the killing of Nizar Banat and by the PA, and so, you know, and the different kind of social mobilizations that came up around then as well, and what they were talking about, and a particular kind of structure and politics that was going on. And I think that is deeply intertwined somewhere in your story when you're talking about the idea of a state that has no sovereignty, and what does this state that has all these security forces also do, and what is it that these kind of zones of stabilization or ideas of a place like Rawabi that give off these illusions of aspiration and normalcy, which I find that maybe many people that are even kind of critical of the project might engage with, that sometimes it's not, these contradictions are a normal part of everyday Palestinian life, that life goes on despite these uncertainties all the time, or despite all these things. But I think there is a link there that you know, there is a great importance actually for your work coming out at that time, even though it might not always feel that way. And you know, but I think that it is part of that same story of everything happening.
Well, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's part of the same story too. I think that what I was sort of referring to, or what I had in mind was, I mean, it was these academic questions of like the object of study, but it was also this personal thing. You know, it was like the stress and the horror of watching what was going on, you know, and not really knowing how to talk about it, and especially not wanting to have to talk about it through myself or my book. You know, I just was not interested in having that conversation move through me at all, you know. And so we had, Lucy mentions, we had a talk, did I say this? I don't remember. We had a talk scheduled in May that was with the historian and Mesna Kato, and with David Harvey. And it was the day after the aerial attacks really started in Gaza, and we just didn't want to do it, you know. And and so I mean, this is also the condition of like writing about Palestine, you know. There are sort of weird issues and stresses, and, you know, instead of doing the talk, I stared at Twitter all day and felt like shit, and, you know, and so I mean, I was, you know, scared for people. And I think that was also what I had in mind, which is like, you know, I think this is part of the same story. And I think, and I was like so glad that in the part about the flip side, I was so glad I actually wrote it into the book. But I mean, I think that yeah, it was difficult to talk about a story that was not the one that felt most present, or most vital, or most important to me. You know, I still like believe my arguments about the need to talk about other things, and to talk about the wide geographies and scales and phenomena that are happening in Palestine. Like I still think that's right, but it wasn't what I felt like talking about at the time. That's sort of what I had in mind, you know. And I think that it's yeah. I mean, I think that it does sort of touch on the same kinds of phenomena. I mean, it is the same sort of like melange of stuff that is also the PA stabilization, PA security forces, PA murder of an activist, and sort of critic. And so I think that I think it's the same sort of thing, and trying to just understand the multiple ways and the multiple places and the multiple, say, scale again, where things are happening in Palestine. Because I think that to talk about sort of like individual forms of violence and not abstract it to the state or the law or the people who are insulated from it, leaves us kind of wanting if we want to talk about the big picture political situation.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I mean, I think it's been really interesting listening to this conversation as well, and thinking about these attachments to certain ideas of the future that work through property, and even kind of this more effective way to think about political economy, which I think is really interesting. I mean, also, I was thinking quite a bit about, for example, in Egypt, Sadat's project that began in kind of the mid 70s to early 80s was also very much about developing these attachments to a future that, would be beyond the reach of most Egyptians, but that for many people seemed something that was attainable. And it was something that was so present in the material landscape through billboards. And even today, I think every time I go back to Cairo, it's just like one big billboard. I mean, it's almost every inch of space on every street has been taken up by a billboard, and they're all advertising real estate. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. And, almost the same themes that we had 30 years ago of like these very European looking families on a beach. But this kind of almost this dream of middle class social mobility through property that still remains such a powerful kind of effective attachment. And like you're saying, for many people, it's understandable why that's the case in the face of everything. So yeah, I was really struck also by this idea of attachment and how these different and competing visions of the future, especially compared to, for example, the revolution, which was a very different type of orientation towards a very different future, are always coming into kind of tension in spaces like Cairo. So yeah, really interesting.
Well, and if they're based in that way, then that's part of how class stratification works. Right?
Definitely. And I mean, I think also so much of the political economy of different projects has been built around this question of real estate now, at least in Egypt. I think one of the big distinctions that emerges, for example, between the military versus kind of that more Mubarak type elite was its emphasis on the types of infrastructures it builds, how it understands property development. And I know, for example, in the late 2000s and leading up to 2011, some of the only property development you were seeing were these gated compounds and shopping malls, and almost nothing else. And I think there's a way in which that became symbolic also of what this ruling class basically understood as kind of development. So I think there's a really interesting way in which you can trace also these major shifts between political projects through this question. And of course, the influence of Gulf capital and how clear that's become in places like Egypt, where I think it's just a huge percentage now that is just built by only Gulf capital. Yeah.
On that, Qatar is obviously very present in Rawabi in terms of financing and in the book, but and correct me if I'm wrong, did you manage to actually speak to any Qatari representative? Because from what I remember from reading the book, I didn't get the impression that, again, the Qataris appear in the book as always in the background. So I'm just wondering, did you have any direct engagement with those financing or manage to talk to any of those Qatari representatives?
I did not manage, no. I mean, I think that was also part, like, I mean, the reason they felt like in the background to you reading it was they felt like in the background to me studying it. And I think that that was sort of part of the, one of the things that kind of led me to make this argument about how forms of capital investment to private firms, but as the idea of development, how that's kind of like scaffolding these practices, you know, how loans are backed, how this project is being sort of backed by the Qataris. And, you know, and I wrote a little bit about it when I talked to some of the then current, probably now former employees of the development firm, about how, you know, they said, you know, the developers are treating the Qataris like an ATM. The Qataris are investing for political reasons. They're not really paying that much attention. You know, there was an audit, but it was whatever. And so I think that that sort of led me to believe that this that there are these forms of investment that, you know, are scaffolding these projects and insulating developers in ways they might not be insulated in other sorts of more direct investment situation. And that is one of the ways that, like, Palestine or investment in Palestine look a little bit different. But yeah, the reason they felt that way to you is because they felt that way to me. I mean, I wish I could have spoken to them.
Great. So I know it seems like there was a little bit of an issue with the live stream and not everyone was able to join, but it will be recorded and up and everything. But I don't know if anybody else, Lucy, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to ask one. It's a bit of a move away from what we've just been talking about so far, but there are the two chapters that deal with Regavim, the settler group, and the use of the law, and how these right-wing settler groups were trying to sort of mirror more liberal Israeli groups in how they were trying to contest particular expropriation strategies through the law. And I was interested to hear, they were really interesting. I was interested to hear about kind of, again, maybe even just speaking a bit more about the process of, you know, writing and researching, and when you come to put it all together out of the messiness of the meanderings of what fieldwork was, what you had access to, what you didn't, what came out, what didn't, the fact the project probably took way longer than was ever expected to ever materialize itself. So, you know, these are the unexpected parts of research that I think are important to talk about. So kind of, I thought maybe it'd be nice to hear about, again, maybe the process of, I think you mentioned it, how you sort of were looking at a court case because Regavim had, you know, contested Rabie and things, but what made you to want to put two chapters in there in that way? And how did you sort of see it fit in to the story you were telling us?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, as people are reading it, that's the least remarked upon part of it, which also I think is indicated now that we're bringing it up at the very end. So I'm actually glad you did. I mean, I guess it's up to readers to decide whether or not I was successful. I think that what I was trying to do was sort of, in my mind, I was thinking about those chapters about the land and sort of shared conceptions of history in the land, and kind of trying to move outwards and to think about, like, what are shared conceptions and how are they sort of shaping and framing what's happening in Palestine. And so rather than sort of the ideas of memory or landholding or sort of prelapsarian life or whatever in the chapters before it, I was thinking about the law and the sort of like liberal law in the West Bank. And so Regavim came up because I was sort of tracking a lot of things about Rabie through the newspaper, through Google alerts, through all sorts of stuff. And then this lawsuit, you know, you heard about settler opposition, these settlers who would come down the hill and protest and sort of make a mess for developers and things like that. And then you started to hear about legal cases. And, you know, and I was talking to my good friend, the anthropologist Nicola Perugini, at that time, and I was like, I've just heard about this thing. He was like, Regavim, I know Regavim. I found Regavim also in this project that he was working on with decolonizing architecture on the Red Castle. So Regavim was one of the groups that was protesting that. And then so Nicola and I did some research together, wrote a piece together, and then I think he sort of continued working on it, and then it figured heavily into the books that he wrote with Neve Gordon, right? And so but like we sort of in conversation with one another and in doing some research together sort of hit on all this mirroring stuff. But that's not our term. That's what the Regavim people are saying. And then when we were talking to the liberal opposition, we talked to Mikhail Spard, we talked to people in Peace Now and BIMCOM and other places. And so so it's that was sort of this is like my version of trying to understand what the mirroring stuff has to do with law and the land in Palestine. And then sort of after we had finished that project, I sort of chased down the legal cases, got them translated because I don't know Hebrew, and started to do that work of really like putting the petitions next to each other to see just how they're mirroring, just how they're shaping their arguments and making their claims. But yeah, it did start with them suing Rawabi for like encroachment on the landscape, basically, for all the things. This relates to a question I didn't answer about the environmental stuff, but suing them for their dump sites, suing them for encroachment onto the landscape. But the landscape, as sort of understood by these radical right-wing settlers, is the entirety of the West Bank, the entirety of Palestine. And so you start to sort of like, I started to swim around in the kind of competing claims about authority and law. And I mean, some of them have kind of like a messianic worldview, others are sort of like just settler right-wingers, and trying to parse all that and to see, or just to sort of ask questions, let's say, about legal practice and what it's doing and what it can encompass, which is pretty big, while at the same time what it can allow, which for Palestinians is pretty small. And so that was sort of the goal there. And yeah, the why I put it there is because I did sort of see it as a way to kind of get bigger and to think about like the different kinds of states that are operating in the same landscape. Why as a sort of a method question did it come up? I mean, it came up through Rawabi. That's where it came up. And then I was very fortunate to have a friend and a colleague who I was talking through a lot of this stuff with. And so yeah, that's why I as I sort of think about this, I'm looking at it. As I think about it, I would have made that argument a little bit more differently and a little bit more explicitly about the state stuff. I think it might sometimes just sort of sit there in a way that I think I could have given a little bit more weight to how it fits into the whole process. But that was why it's there.
Great, thank you. I mean, oh, sorry, Lucy, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, and thank you also for just writing such a wonderful book, and that really helps other people like me and others who are trying to grapple with this whole thing. And it's really I can feel how hard it is to have written about it and studied it and put all these elements in together. And so you did such a wonderful job. And yeah, congratulations, really, Elf Mabruk. It's really wonderful. And yeah, that's what I want to say.
I hope I don't sound like I'm just complaining. But thank you. I'm really grateful for everybody. It sounds like we're wrapping up, right? I mean, I'm really grateful for everybody's comments and time, and really sort of like careful and generous and productive readings and conversations, and for everybody at LSE for organizing it. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you, Kareem. Also, yeah, for writing such a great book, and thank you all for contributing. This was an amazing conversation. I feel like I have so much to think about now as well. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for Lucy for co-organizing with me, and Amy. And we'll see you all soon, hopefully in real life next time. Have a good night or day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kareem.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lucy, Amy. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.